So now that we've mapped out our stakeholders, we've identified them, the next question you need to ask yourself is, how do I intend to engage with these stakeholders? I deliberately use the phrase engage here over manage because stakeholder management is more about engaging with them, not managing them. One of the traps we can have is to view stakeholders as people that we need to manage. But really, stakeholder management is a two-way street. We've got to engage with them. We really need to build a working relationship with them. And with any good relationship, there's an element of give and take and open and regular conversations to have together. So instead of trying to view our stakeholders as people to be managed, we want to view them as people that we need to have a relationship with and we need to engage with. This is something I talk about in the first 90 days. I talk about a relationship backlog and creating a very deliberate way to form relationships and make sure that we are managing our stakeholders through that, which sets a really good foundation for us to be able to influence our stakeholders in the future. If you can start to make this shift even mentally from stakeholder manage or like manage stakeholders to engage stakeholders, it can be huge. You start to be more sympathetic towards them and you start to approach it with curiosity about how can I understand your world better and get you to basically solve both of our goals. How can we work together as a team as opposed to I'm trying to do something and you're a nuisance and I'm just trying to manage you. That's the wrong mentality to have. Now that we have all of our stakeholders mapped out, the first question that we need to start to ask ourselves before we get into how we're going to engage with our stakeholders is why? Why do I need to engage with this stakeholder? Now, this is a very important question to ask yourself because often we put stakeholders down, we just rattle them all out because we're trying to capture all the stakeholders. What we want to now do is to challenge ourselves. Why do I need to have a relationship with this stakeholder? Now, in the first 90 days course, I actually get participants to write it down and actually articulate the why. And I talk about trying to be very specific. Now, you don't need to write down the why here, but I would encourage you to be specific. Don't just come up with something generic like marketing is an important stakeholder. Like, why are they an important stakeholder? Oh, because I need to be able to align marketing messaging about this product and how it's positioned in the market so it can complement my strategy and how this and product success, right? That's where you want to get to. We want to be granular, we want to be specific, and we want to be detailed. So we want to challenge ourselves. Now, some stakeholders might fall off the map as a result of it. Some stakeholders might move into a different stakeholder category. Depending on which stakeholder map you did, you might move them like up in importance or down in importance. Or if you're doing the circles, you might move them between being a direct or an indirect or a core stakeholder. Once we've done that, we then want to start to ask ourselves how. Now, as you saw, the two stakeholder mapping techniques that I picked, they both start to shape the how already. What we want to do is we want to use the quadrants or the circles that the stakeholders sit in, and we want to start to use that in order to inform how we actually go about engaging with them. So if you're using the first technique, you can basically break down your stakeholders into these different categories between core, direct, and indirect. And this is going to guide you in how you want to engage with them. So for example, right in the center, your core stakeholders, these are your most important stakeholders as mentioned. These are people who are directly involved day to day. This is one of their primary concerns, and they are the most important stakeholders for you. As a result, what we want to do with these stakeholders is we want to engage with them at a high frequency. And we also want to do it in a way that it is what I like to call high touch. So what do I mean by these two things? Well, frequency is all about how frequently are you going to engage with that stakeholder? Daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly, or even on an ad hoc basis. Stakeholders that need a high frequency, those towards the center, or the important stakeholders with high influence, you're going to want to catch up with them, weekly at the minimum, maybe multiple times a week, but you want to do it in a very regular manner. So that's kind of your options there. Really try and dial it up for them. Now, one of the things to think about when you think about frequency is don't just think about how often do we need to meet. A frame of mind that I get product managers to do, and this really changed the way that I thought about it when I kind of basically came to this realization, is to think about how long can you go without meeting that it would become a problem. So what do I mean by that? So often we say, well, I think we just need to catch up once a month. If I keep you engaged and I keep you informed once a month, that's sufficient enough. Well, I want to flip that. That is saying that we can go a month, 4 weeks or so, we can go a month without engaging with each other before it becomes a problem. So if we don't engage for longer than a month, let's say we don't engage for a couple of months, then that will become a problem. They'll start to ask questions. They don't feel like they're involved. They don't know what's going on. Now, this is an important framing because what inevitably happens with any type of stakeholder engagement thing is we end up having to cancel something or skip a session. Now, you should be trying very hard to not skip things and definitely don't let that become like a regular occurrence. But what I mean by that is inevitably a session is going to be skipped or canceled for whatever reason. So I go back to the previous question, how long can you go without meeting before it becomes a problem? Now, if the answer is a month, this doesn't mean we catch up once a month. This means we need to catch up twice a month. Because if we skipped a session at once a month, it would be 2 months before we actually catch up again and have that session. And 2 months is too long. Yes, you can try and reschedule, but sometimes rescheduling just gets pushed out, and then you meet twice in the month anyways because you had to reschedule. So you might as well start there. Let's just meet twice a month. Let's meet every 2 weeks. That is a much better starting point to be at, and to miss one, and that it's totally okay. We skip it, we miss it, that's fine. And it's also better to have it and to not use it, or to have it and for the meeting or whatever forum you end up using, which we'll get into in a second, it being very quick. Because if you're catching up twice a month, you're going to be able to cover a lot less ground in each meeting as opposed to once a month. So if it takes you an hour to get through everything once a month, you can probably do 2 half hours. So you don't actually end up using more time. In my experience, you definitely don't. Everything kind of moves relative to each other's. So I want you to use that frame of mind. How long can we go without meeting? So that's frequency. Now, on the other hand, we have touch. So what do I mean by high touch? Well, high touch is really something that is tailored to them. Think about like white glove service, as it's often called. What we mean by this is that these stakeholders are so important. We actually want to be able to tailor the way that we engage to them and their needs. This often means that we're doing things like one-on-ones, or even the way that we package our messaging. We do it in a very, very tailored way to them. We're not trying to send them generic messaging that's going out to all stakeholders. We're actually crafting it just for them. It is directly addressed to them. So the options you have in high touch are things like one-on-ones, obviously tailored communication. You're going to have moments where you might need to collaborate with them, actually bring them into workshops. But these are the types of things. So most commonly for core stakeholders, what we see is that we are engaging them at a high frequency, once a week, once every 2 weeks, generally around that time frame. And we're doing it in a way that it's often done as a bespoke one-on-one type meeting. But once we're finished with the core stakeholders, as we start to move out, these 2 dimensions become your 2 lever points. So if I jump now right all the way to the outside, to the other end of the spectrum, to the other extreme, we essentially have our indirect stakeholders, who are the ones that we are going to engage at a low frequency and in a very low touch way. So what do I mean by that? Well, obviously frequency is quite easy to answer. It is just the opposite to that high frequency. We're not engaging them on a weekly or 2 weekly basis. At the most, we're engaging them once a month. It is not uncommon for our stakeholders here for us to be engaging even less frequently than that. If you're only updating the co-founder or someone in the C-suite who is an indirect stakeholder once every quarter, that could be completely applicable and completely fine in your context. Now, from a low touch point of view, our options here are things like generic stakeholder forums. So you might do product showcases or these kind of update forums where we bring a wide range of stakeholders together. Now, the difference here is, and this is why it's low touch, is we're not trying to tailor that session to any specific stakeholder. It is a generic session, not tailored to them, definitely not tailored to the indirect ones, and we're doing it in a very low touch way. So it's kind of like high scale, low effort, if that makes sense. We're not trying to put a huge amount of energy and effort into them. We're not trying to tailor the message to any one stakeholder in particular. It is low touch in that regards. It is a generic one. They can come along, get their update, and that is it. Other options here are like asynchronous forms of communication. We might do a similar thing to that generic update forum, but we might do it as an email. We might send out something like week notes at the end of the week, or we might send out a newsletter. So these are essentially crafted emails that aren't specific to any one area. They are generic. They are kind of mass. For the masses, we send it out to everyone, and we would include the indirect stakeholders there. When indirect stakeholders try to push for more tailored messaging, we need to be able to balance that against how we're prioritizing our time. So this is a really good tool to be able to frame what type of stakeholder they are and whether that request is actually warranted for you to actually investigate and actually put the energy into tailoring or not. So what we end up having is a spectrum between those who are core stakeholders who need a high frequency of engagement and a high touch form of engagement, all the way out to our indirect stakeholders, which we engage at a low frequency and in a low touch way. Now, obviously, as we move through the stakeholders and we get to the stakeholders in the middle, being the direct stakeholders, these become our two levers that we can pull. We can either dial up the frequency as we get closer to the center and they become more important, or we can dial it down as we go out. We can dial up the level of touch and how much bespokeness and tailoredness we do for those stakeholders, or we can dial it down and just invite them to a generic forum or send them a generic update. So as an activity, when we're creating our stakeholder engagement strategy and plan, we want to consider where our stakeholders sit on this map. And what I would invite you to do next, after you've mapped out your stakeholders, is to actually go through all of them and think about these two dimensions and think about how you intend to engage with those stakeholders. So literally right next to the name, write down on another post-it note or on a piece of paper right next to them or on the same post-it note, how do you intend to engage with them? What is it that you're going to engage? Is it going to be a high touch method like a one-on-one? Or is it going to be more of a low touch method? Is it going to be an email even? Or is it going to be inviting them to a generic product update meeting? And then the second piece of information I want you to write down there and think about is at what frequency? Do I need to catch up with this stakeholder on a weekly basis? Or do I need to catch up with them on a monthly basis or even less frequently than that? Again, there's no right or wrong way in how you create a stakeholder engagement strategy, but the important thing is to think about how you're going to engage these stakeholders and to make sure that you're not treating all stakeholders equally. And on top of that, you want to also better manage your time. You're going to have diminishing value from having a weekly one-on-one with an indirect stakeholder versus having a weekly one-on-one with a direct stakeholder or a core stakeholder. Those indirect ones, you can then just send out an email. Equally, you don't want to just send everyone a weekly email about what's going on, even though you will, but you don't want to just do that because then your direct and core stakeholders will become very dissatisfied, disgruntled and unhappy, and they'll start to cause havoc and create friction for you, and that'll be something very difficult for you to have to manage. So better to bring them in early, engage them, and make sure that you're engaging them in an effective manner. The other thing that this starts to do is when you do decide to run workshops and those types of things and collaboration sessions, it actually makes the invite list really, really easy. What I always do when I'm running a collaboration session is I go back to my stakeholder map and I look at direct stakeholders and inwards, and they are essentially the people that I'll be inviting to that workshop, whatever it may be. I may need to overlay the context of that workshop and work out, are these stakeholders the right ones to be in there or not? Maybe we're doing something very, solution design heavy and might be more engineering heavy. Might be doing something more marketing and sales heavy, and I can ignore engineering as an example. But you might need to put that lens on it. But really, it's already given you your invite list already. Direct stakeholders and down. At the end of the day, what you want to do is have a deliberate strategy with how you're going to engage with your stakeholders. Don't apply a blanket rule to all stakeholders. Not all stakeholders are created equally, and we need to treat them differently. That is going to set you up for far better success in the long run. And also, it's going to help you not have a calendar full of one-on-one meetings. That is the last thing any of us want. And we can be better targeted and deliberate with not just only our time, but also our stakeholders' time as well.